Hello, viewers, and welcome to the first expansion evaluation episode of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game Progression series. My name is Mitch.
And my name is Matthew.
And today we'll be cracking open our very first adventure pack. This is The Hunt for Gollum of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. Matthew and I have previously discussed each and every player and hero card of the core set in beginning our evaluation series, but now we're moving on to cover the new hero and player cards introduced in the first of LOTR LCG's mostly monthly expansions. So, Matthew, please do us the honor of introducing us all to our first post-core set hero.
All right, up first is Bilbo Baggins of the Lore Sphere. Bilbo has a threat cost of 9, willpower strength of 1, attack strength of 1, defense strength of 2, and 2 hit points. Bilbo is a hobbit, of course, and his ability reads, the first player draws 1 additional card in the resource phase. So, straight away, Bilbo sort of breaks the mold a bit, in that for the vast majority of heroes in the core set days, and even up until today, if you add up all of their stats, willpower, attack, and defense strength plus hit points, it equals their threat cost. In this case, Bilbo only adds up to 6, but his threat cost is a whopping 9, so 3 additional points. I think the biggest point of contention with Bilbo is his ability worth the additional 3 points of threat that he costs? And certainly we can discuss that and see what we think, but straight away, that's what I notice.
So, Bilbo strikes me as somewhat of an unusual hero. I'm used to selecting my heroes based on their ability to do one thing extraordinarily well. Mm-hmm. The natural comparison here is Barivor, because for 1 additional point of threat, she's able to draw 2 cards per round, she's able to commit twice as much willpower to the quest as Bilbo can, she attacks harder, she's a better natural defender. The list goes on and on. But if you do pick Bilbo, you can have him accomplish multiple tasks during the same game round. So with Barivor, you basically dedicate her to filling 1 role. But even in just you and I playing through some of those core set scenarios, how many occasions have there been where we've wanted Barivor to draw cards for us, but instead we've had to use her as an attacker or defender or something along those lines. And
right.
At the very least, Bilbo does afford players the luxury of doing a lot, just not particularly well.
Yeah, one of the things I appreciate about him is his utility in multiplayer. I told this story many times, either on previous Progression Series videos or on The Great Company. At least I think I've told this story. But that's when I first started the game in 2011. When it came out, I was a solo player only. But eventually, a local gaming group got started at my card shop, and I've never looked back. I haven't played solo since. So I kind of wish there were more multiplayer cards, although I know solo players say they wish there were more solo-only cards, so that's a debate for another day. But I like the fact that he can give card draw to anyone. I mean, so can Barivor technically, but you're right, she has to exhaust, and then that becomes a very strategic decision. Well, I need to defend with her or quest with her, but we really want the card draw. Bilbo, it's automatic. And while it's only the first player, you can't target it. And while it's only 1 card, when I'm the tactics player and I don't have a lot of card draw, I really appreciate it. So I do like the fact that they were trying to spread the love around a little bit more generously without having to exhaust a character. But with that said, he's just a squishy little hobbit, and there's not a whole lot that he's going to do. I mean, questing for 1 is marginal. Attacking for 1 is marginal. Defending for 2 is okay, but it's a little bit risky when he only has 2 hit points.
Yeah, exactly. And once we crack open Adventure Pack 3, there's going to be a Treachery, which can deal 2 damage to characters that are exhausted. And if you're using Bilbo even for questing, like you said, he's not contributing a large volume of willpower in the first place, and he's just so susceptible to being destroyed.
Yeah.
even Eowyn with 3 hit points feels fairly hardy relative to our Hobbit here, and it just strikes me as so odd how when Barivor first came out, it seems like she was so incredibly powerful because there was no errata, there was no limit to the number of times you could activate her ability, and with Bilbo, it just seems like he's so reined in. You can't use readying effects to force additional card draw opportunities out of him, and as much as I do agree that I think it's cool that his card draw bounces from me to you to a possible player 3 or 4, especially in the early phases of this game, it just seems in LOTR you're always digging for some kind of card that's going to be pulling you out of a crisis, or that's going to help you establish some sort of powerful engine that once you get it up and operational, you're going to be able to relatively handily handle the encounter deck. So if you're trying to dig for Northern Tracker as quickly as possible, Barivor just gets you there faster. And in the context of our core set plus Hunt for Gollum card pool, I just don't feel like lore is powerful enough to warrant more than one hero unless you're playing like a 3 or 4 player game. So I just think Bilbo is kind of a representative of an overall weak sphere. He's very expensive for what he does. He can become a pretty decent defender once we start to see way more cards, but at the moment he just strikes me as rather underwhelming. So I like what they're trying with Bilbo, but it just seems like he's not quite optimal to include in a deck at this point. But I mean, Matthew, you've got more modern day experience than I do. The hobbits don't end up getting developed until much deeper into our card pool. I suppose, what are just some trends we might see, and does he eventually become just a more viable deck option?
Sadly, he doesn't. There will be certain aspects of the game, secrecy being one, hobbits being developed being another, where hobbits and secrecy are sort of a natural meld. But again, with his extra 3 threat cost relative to the other hobbits, who for the most part their threat cost adds up to their stat line here, he just doesn't see a lot of play. And as we get more and more Hobbit heroes, again, poor Bilbo is relegated, I think, to the binder. So if any hero needs a second version, I think it's Bilbo.
Yeah, it just seems like when they initially designed this card, they were just being a little bit too cautious, a little bit too careful, and frankly, his threat cost is just too high for what he affords players. You mentioned secrecy. That's a mechanic we'll end up seeing a little bit later, where you want to keep your threat at 20 or lower, and it's really difficult to do that when you start off with some weak hero that already costs 9, so one last time, I like what they tried to do, but not a big Bilbo fan here. But I suppose moving past our hero, let's break into our leadership sphere player cards. Go ahead and walk us through those.
First up for leadership is an attachment, Dunedain Mark. It costs 1, and it has the signal trait. It must attach to a hero, and the attached hero gets +1 attack strength. It also has an action. Pay 1 resource from attached hero's pool to attach Dunedain Mark to another hero. I actually really like this card. I think there was a period early on in this particular cycle where it was fairly popular, and then it sort of went away, I feel like, for a while. And at least in my more contemporary decks, I use a ton of these signals because they're cheap, easy ways to boost attack and defense. And while I don't use the action quite as often, there have been games where I have used it, and it's been very helpful. So I'm really big on these. The Dunedain have been sort of a resurgence, have been in resurgence with the past couple of cycles, and so signals have seen a little bit more love. But even within the realm of core set plus Hunt for Gollum here, I still think it's a nice, cheap way to boost attack that we otherwise just don't really have.
Yeah, this is a pretty cool card. It's extremely cheap and it's in leadership, and previously the only thing leadership had to boost attack is 4 Gondor, and it just seems like the cost of 2 for an ephemeral bonus is pretty steep when you could just save it and spend it on an ally. Dunedain Mark is an attachment, but it's not a weapon. It's not restricted, so you could dump this onto any character that you'd like, provided that it's a hero, and it just gets a flat attack bonus. It's not conditional in that it's only when you're attacking a spider or something along those lines. It's just you draw it, you can put it into play, you can increase the likelihood that Legolas is going to be able to accrue progress tokens for you. It makes it easier for heroes like Aragorn to kill enemies, and really it just is kind of difficult for any sphere outside of tactics to give significant attack bonuses to characters. You could even put this on Dune here, along with maybe something like Dwarven Axe, just to make it more possible for him to kill enemies in the staging area. It is cool that you can bounce this between heroes. I've personally not used that very often, but if there's some sort of situation where you have to defend with one of your heroes and the shadow effect is an attack bonus to the enemy and your hero is going to be dying, you've got an action window to move the Dunedain Mark off of your defender onto another hero. And the same thing goes if you need to, for some reason, move this between heroes. I could attack an enemy engaged with me, then I could pay a resource to move Dunedain Mark to one of my ranged heroes and attack something engaged with you. So it's kind of a subtle effect, but it's very cool, and because you and I have the luxury of knowing what's coming up in our card pool, this may not seem like the most significant effect, but it's really just one of scarcely few attack increasing cards outside of tactics.
Our final leadership card of this adventure pack is the 1-cost event, Campfire Tales. Action, each player draws 1 card. Much like Dunedain Mark, it's a cheap effect that's pretty good. I think it's decent in solo. You pay 1 resource to draw 1 card, but certainly as you add more players, 2, 3, 4, it's 1 cost to draw maybe 2 or 3 or 4 cards across the whole table. It's a great card. I still use it to this day. It's very simple, but in a sphere that doesn't have a ton of card draw, lore predominantly dominates there. I think that, it's pretty good.
Really, I don't think I see anything not to like about this card. During the resource phase, each player draws 1 card, and for each of their heroes, they acquire 1 resource token. So even in a single-player environment, if you're spending one of those up to 3 resources per turn in exchange for a card, that seems like a pretty reasonable deal. It thins your deck, it makes it more likely that you're going to walk into those combo pieces and power cards, and if you're in a 2, 3, or 4 player game, it just seems like the value of this card rises dramatically very quickly. So I think this is a fantastic leadership card in that you're affecting and helping all players at once, and card draw, almost never a bad thing, so I think when possible, I include up to 3 copies of Campfire Tales in most every leadership deck. But with leadership out of the way, let's move on and cover tactics.
Our first tactics card is the 2-cost ally, Winged Guardian. It's a creature, and it's an eagle. 0 willpower, 0 attack, 4 defense strength, and 1 hit point. The Winged Guardian is Sentinel, and it cannot have restricted attachments. Forced, after an attack in which Winged Guardian defends resolves, pay 1 tactics resource or discard Winged Guardian from play. Certainly one of the best defenders in the game at this point in the game's life, and it remains one of the best defenders for quite a while. Certainly you have to pay a resource or you lose the Winged Guardian, which sort of sucks, but it's a great card. Certainly we get into different mechanics and quests and stuff where this guy is going to see a resurgence of utility. Things like siege questing, where you quest with your defense value instead of your willpower value. But even outside of that, I still think it's a pretty fun card.
This is a really interesting one. So it's got Sentinel, which off the bat makes it great in that you can defend for other players. It's reasonably cheap. There's a lot of tactics characters I'm comfortable defending with for the cost of 2 resources. And with 4 defense, that puts this right up there with Gandalf in that it's tied for the highest defense value in the game on a player card at the moment. I think it can be a little bit difficult for a tactics player to keep paying that 1 resource, but in a lot of situations, if you can manage to do so, 1 resource to block an enemy attack is a pretty good value. It does kind of suck that this only has a paltry 1 hit point, but it's not like you're normally going to be questing with it, so it's not going to be destroyed by damage to exhausted characters type effects. You want to make sure that you kind of play this card according to whatever scenario you're against. So if you are playing Journey Along the Anduin and you have 35 threat, maybe you want to keep this in your hand because you're concerned that something like Evil Storm is going to outright annihilate this. But eagles and creatures end up becoming pretty important because sometimes it's only eagles that can defend against certain types of enemies like birds or bats. Creatures, once we get to conflict at the Carrick, there's going to be treacheries that specifically ask players to sacrifice creatures in order to negate pretty powerful effects. So I think under ideal circumstances, Winged Guardian is great. It can defend, you can spend a resource, it stays on the table, and you get some really efficient defenses or blocks. But even, I think the worst case defensive scenario is you're stomaching an enemy attack, and it only costs 2 resources. Even if you're having it defend against something like a hill troll, it'll absorb 5 points of damage prior to being destroyed, and in that case, there's only 1 spillover point of damage, and you only gain a single point of threat. So this strikes me as pretty fantastic. I'm a fan of Ranged and Sentinel, so Winged Guardian, just total fantastic card from my perspective.
I'm an Eagle fanboy myself, so I couldn't agree more. Speaking of Eagles, up next, the zero cost event, The Eagles Are Coming. It has the trait Eagle and action. Search the top 5 cards of your deck for any number of Eagle cards and add them to your hand. Shuffle the other cards back into your deck. I'm a little less keen on this card, I think, perhaps, than I am some of the other Eagle cards that we might see in the future, but it's still pretty good, right? So if you want to make an Eagle deck, this is perhaps an auto-include in that it can help you get those Eagles into your hand more, so you have a bit more versatility. Interestingly enough, this card has the Eagle trait, so if the top 5 cards of your deck have another The Eagles Are Coming, you can also grab that card, which is kind of helpful and cool. So it's a good card. It really doesn't belong much outside of a deck that's running a lot of Eagles, which at this point in the game's life, there's only the Winged Guardian, so probably not worth including. But with that said, once we get the full smattering of Eagles, I think it's a decent enough card to include in your deck.
So this is a very interesting card because it affords the tactics sphere of influence one of scarcely few opportunities to actually get some card advantage. And within the core set, as we move beyond the core set, if ever there was a sphere that could benefit from drawing additional cards, it's probably going to be tactics, just because they never really get very many tools to just reel in additional cards without relying on additional spheres. And if you're playing Eagles, this is a tempting card to include in your deck, just because it's possible you might draw multiple cards for the investment of no resources. But the problem here is that you have to be playing Eagles, and this has the possibility of whiffing and failing to retrieve any cards for you. And if you draw this and play it and don't actually actually hit any eagle cards, then it's essentially the same as not having drawn a card at all, and that's a huge bummer. So this is a card where you have to do a little bit of mathematics just to determine whether or not you feel it's worth including in your deck. As of the Hunt for Gollum, there are only 2 Eagle trait cards. There's the Eagles Are Coming event itself, and there's the Winged Guardian we just discussed, and that means that you can have a total of 6 Eagle cards in your deck. So you have to look at something called a hypergeometric distribution to determine whether or not this is worth it. And let's say your opening hand is 6 cards, you draw a 7th card during your first resource phase, and if one of those cards happens to be the Eagles Are Coming, you can determine what the likelihood of drawing one or more Eagle cards upon playing this event is, just based on how many of those Eagles you have in your deck, how many you've already drawn, so the math is always changing. But if you've got, let's say, 5 different Eagle cards remaining in your deck, it's your first turn, you've got a 47.9% chance to get at least 1 Eagles card in those top 5 cards of your deck. So it's specifically a 38.3% chance that you'll get 1 Eagle, but the odds of getting 2 Eagle cards is already down to 8.8%, and the odds of drawing 3 of your 5 Eagle cards in those top 5 cards is already down to 0.7%. So out the gate, the Eagles Are Coming is more likely than not to outright whiff, and it's not until much later in the cycle that it starts to become a fairly powerful form of card draw. Over the course of the entire Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, we end up seeing 4 additional Eagle trait cards, and even if you include the maximum number of copies for each of those in your deck, something which isn't necessarily advisable or guaranteed, if you've got 18 Eagle cards, if on turn number 1 you play a copy of the Eagles Are Coming under that kind of circumstance, you've got a 93.2% chance of ending up with at least 1 Eagle in those top 5 cards if there was no other Eagle card in your opening hand. And just breaking down the numbers specifically, it's 26.4% chance of 1 Eagle card, 36.7% chance of 2 Eagle cards, a 23% chance of 3 Eagle cards, but the odds of 4 Eagle cards is 6.4%, and the odds of 5 Eagle cards in the top 5 is a pathetic 0.6% chance. So that was a lot of numbers, and these are always adjusting on the fly based on how many Eagle cards you've already seen, how many cards you've drawn through your deck without seeing Eagle cards. So this and all other tutoring effects, it's a bit of a headache to decide whether or not you want to include them, but they're very powerful to consider. They can afford you a wealth of options, like if you're fortunate enough to stumble across, say, 2 to 5 different Eagle cards, you can draw all of them, and then you've got the luxury of picking and choosing what you want to play. And even with other tutoring cards, when it comes to digging for what you're really looking for, it does give you the power of choice. Eventually, we see a hero that allows you to return tactics events from your discard pile to your hand, and that's kind of a powerful in-tactics card draw engine in and of itself right there, but I'm sure as confusing and long-winded as that explanation was, I would say at the moment, this event is probably worth skipping, but over time, it does start to become worth it. But moving away from mathematics and probability as quickly as possible, Matthew, what about our spirit cards?
Yeah, Mitch, I'm trying to enjoy a game, not learn a math lesson. But with that said, our spirit ally, 2 cost, Westfold Horsebreaker, 1 willpower strength, 0 attack, 1 defense strength, 1 measly hit point. He is Rohan. An action, discard Westfold Horsebreaker to choose and ready a hero. There aren't a whole lot of ways to ready characters at this point in the game. Unexpected Courage, of course, being perhaps the most popular and universal, but also not being a 3-of card in the core set. So you had to buy, get multiple copies of the core set to have 3 copies of Unexpected Courage. So this is one way that you can ready heroes even if you didn't have 3 copies of Unexpected Courage. Rohan, like the Eagles, is going to be a sub-theme of this particular cycle, although I don't think Rohan comes into its own until much later. I think it's a decent card. It was certainly better in the time that it came out when Horn of Gondor was not errated. So this guy would have not only discarded himself, but also, if Horn of Gondor was on the table, have triggered a resource. Sadly, that's no longer the case, which makes his cost a little bit tougher to stomach. But there are cards that still trigger, even in Rohan synergy, many, many years down the line, off characters leaving play. So I like the fact that he can ready a hero. I've used the effect from time to time, but typically I just quest with him if he's in a deck and on the table.
Yeah, this is a character that I like much more in theory than in practice, because it is a powerful ability. You can quest with it, you could potentially defend with it, and then you could discard it. It doesn't have to be ready. You don't have to exhaust it in order to benefit from that ability, which in and of itself is pretty cool. It's just not that often that I need to ready a hero. I guess it would always be nice, but most of the time I would just rather keep this ally in play than sacrifice it to have Gimli defend and attack, or to have Legolas attack twice. I don't generally play 3 or 4 player games, so maybe if there are more enemies on the table, it's going to be more likely that you'll throw away this character to benefit from that effect. But as is, I just never seem to use it very often. With that said, I like the fact that this is a 4th ally available to Spirit. When you and I play, it seems that we slap Steward of Gondor on Éowyn. She starts to accumulate a ton of Spirit resources, and then it's just kind of crossing your fingers, hoping and praying that you end up drawing those expensive Spirit cards to put out, just because you've got all of your eggs in your Spirit basket. So having another, eligible sink for those Spirit resources, I think is great. This is a nice alternative to Wandering Took. It's a bummer that it can't attack, but if you don't need to kind of juggle threat levels around, I think this is a perfectly acceptable ally to include in your deck. A lot of cool stuff you can do with this one.
Yeah, and continuing my sort of multiplayer love theme with Bilbo, again, this can ready any hero. It doesn't have to be one of your own, as you were mentioning. So, very versatile in solo play, but even more versatile in multiplayer play.
Yeah, so I'll just say we talked about Bilbo not being fantastic. This works super well with Barivore in that you can have her quest, you can have her attack or defend, and then you can also draw cards. You could have Denethor defend twice, you could have Denethor defend and scry, and as we get more and more heroes with more and more abilities, the options here are limitless. So it seems like a powerful effect. It isn't quite as good as I initially thought it would be, but certainly nothing wrong with this character, and yeah, I am a fan of this Spirit ally.
Up next, I am mustering myself for another Mitch math lesson with the Spirit 1-cost event, Mustering the Rohirrim. Action: search the top 10 cards of your deck for any one Rohan ally and add it to your hand. Then shuffle the other cards back into your deck. Very, very similar to The Eagles Are Coming. It does cost 1, but it allows you to search the top 10 instead of the top 5, and this is only an ally card, not anything with the eagle trait. So a little bit more limiting in some ways, a little bit more versatile in others. Again, if we're thinking of our sort of progression card pool, probably not worth including. There are only a smattering of Rohan allies at this point, but by a couple years down the road, when Rohan is a fully fleshed out trait, it's still a pretty good card. Some people hate paying 1 for it. They'd rather it be free, but it's still a way to get that one ally you might be looking for that will really help shore up whatever deficiency you have. So I think it's a decent card, if not the most exciting or flashy thing.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that we see a couple of these tutoring or searching effects in our very first adventure pack when our card pool kind of offers up slim pickings in regard to Rohan allies and Eagle cards. I do like that you get to search 10 cards. That's a huge number, but you are only finding one ally, so no events, no attachments. Just like you said, it's just one Rohan ally. Currently, our available Rohan allies are kind of distributed across a fair few different spheres. So Gleowine, the Snowborn Scout, Horseback Archer, and then the Westfold Horsebreaker that we just talked about. So let's say you're playing a mono spirit deck and you're running Mustering the Rohirrim and your only Rohan ally is 3 copies of Westfold Horsebreaker. You start the game with your opening 6 cards. During Resource Phase 1, you draw a card. If you don't have any Rohan allies in hand, if you play Mustering the Rohirrim, the odds of one of your 3 Rohan allies being somewhere in those 10 cards, you've got a 55.8% chance of finding at least one copy. But if you're running 6 Rohan allies and you've got 6 Rohan allies left in those 43 cards, all of a sudden you've got 81.8% chance of finding at least one ally in those top 10. This effect can still miss, but at that point it might give you a choice between, 2 different allies. If you include 3 different allies, 3 copies of each, so that you've got 9 total targets in your deck, at that point it's a 93.2% chance that you're going to find at least something. If you've got 12 total allies, it goes to 97.7%, and by the time you have 15 different Rohan allies, 15 different targets, at that point you're almost guaranteed to find at least something because it's a 99.3% chance. And, by the time the math gets that much in your favor, you've probably got a few options to choose from, and as the card pool gets broader and broader, you start to get some Rohan allies that do qualify as those power cards that will make or break a given scenario based on how quickly you see them. So, like I said before, the quicker your deck gets up and fully operational, the better, the more likely you're going to be to beat a scenario. So, I don't think that the Eagles are coming or Mustering the Rohirrim is necessarily something that Matthew and I are going to be playing anytime soon, but it's definitely a couple of cards we'll be keeping our eyes on, and I'm sure we will be playing those eventually. But with those effects out of the way, let's talk about one more retrieval type card. Matthew, start us off with our lore ally.
We've got the Rivendell Minstrel. She costs 3, 2 willpower strength, 0 attack, 0 defense strength, and 1 measly hit point. She is Noldor. And response. After you play Rivendell Minstrel from your hand, search your deck for 1 song card and add it to your hand. Shuffle your deck. I'll have to say straight away, I'm not really a fan of songs or song decks that become a bit more powerful, I think, as the game goes on. First cycle, we don't have a ton of songs, and we will be talking about a song here shortly. But she's kind of like a one-hit wonder to me. Although, meaning she does her thing, and then that's pretty much it. But I will say she quests for 2, but that 1 measly hit point, she's, definitely at risk for things like Necromancer's Reach, and you're basically playing her to find a song in case you can't get one in your opening hand.
Yeah, this ally, I like it, but it's not as good as I wish it was. Bilbo gives me pause with 2 hit points and 1 hit point if the encounter deck, shakes suddenly or shifts suddenly. The Rivendell Minstrel may as well just implode from that alone. The Necromancer's Reach kills it. Exhaustion from A Journey to Rosgobel annihilates this character. Mm-hmm. I love that it's the first 2 willpower non-unique ally that we've seen in the game. But like I said with Bilbo, lore isn't so powerful that I'm generally running more than 1 lore hero, which means that lore resources are a scarce commodity, and if I have to choose between Rivendell Minstrel or Daughter of the Nemredel or Self-Preservation or Forest Snare, You can't have everything, and there's not such a wide variety of songs at the moment that you really want to include the Rivendell Minstrel in your deck. So, if you're using the song cards for their intended purpose, that's great. The worst case scenario is you play this for 3, it quests for 2, you have an additional card anywhere in your deck to add to your hand, and then you could maybe discard that to get an additional point of willpower toward Eowyn or something along those lines. So it's not amazing, but I will say what I do like is once we start to see more and more songs, there's no look at the top 5, look at the top 10. It's just if it's a song, you can look through your deck and add it immediately to your hand. So as we see more and more songs, the power level here only stands to increase.
That brings us to our final lore card, the 1-cost event, Strider's Path. Response: after a location is revealed from the encounter deck, immediately travel to that location without resolving its travel effect. If another location is currently active, return it to the staging area. Probably a card that I would love to go back to the original Progression Series video and see what I thought of it. I didn't for this particular episode. But if I didn't like it then, I can certainly say I like it and appreciate it now, particularly with the advent of Nightmare mode, where a lot of the Nightmare decks have just the worst travel effects that you could imagine, and you want to avoid them. This is a nice, cheap way to do so. A drawback, a lot of locations, particularly the nastiest locations, are immune to player card effects, and so you might run into some issues there. With that said, in the current pool that we're dealing with, I don't know if there are a ton of, oh my gosh, I cannot stomach this particular travel effect that it would warrant including in a deck. But I think it's one of the top sideboard cards, meaning if you're tweaking your deck a little bit based on what you know of a scenario, you might want this sort of in your back pocket, ready to slap in a deck. I don't think it's an auto-include, but I do absolutely think in certain scenarios with really nasty locations, it is stellar.
Yeah, this is kind of an intriguing card because a lot of people thought this belonged in the core set. When you ran up against locations like the Necromancer's Pass very often, that's a 3-threat location, and to travel there, the first player has to discard 2 cards. If you can bypass that threat, that's awesome. If you can bypass having to discard cards, that's even better. This is a cheap effect, and even as we start to see locations that have negative effects or penalties while they sit in the staging area, that counteracts those as well. It's a little bit scenario specific just because if a location has an effect while it's active, then this doesn't do anything really, and it's possible that since this replaces a currently active location, you might return something nasty to the staging area, but if you're playing logically and tactically, you're not going to set yourself up to stomach the same nasty travel effect twice. I think this is a very cool card to dodge something like the Brown Lands, which has 5 threat. It's an alternative or a supplement to Secret Paths, which outright just nullifies a location's threat value, because in many ways this is bypassing threat value and a travel effect. I think it's a little bit of a bummer that eventually we're going to be seeing a Spirit Ally, which just kind of, it has this ability built into it, but it's a cool little card. If you're running a Legolas to generate additional progress tokens with or without Blade of Gondolin, you can use this to kind of expedite the rate at which you're clearing out locations. So let's say during one round, during combat, you clear an active location. During staging, you reveal a location. You play Strider's Path to make it the active location. Then you resolve the quest. You clear out your Strider's Path location. During the travel phase, you make a new location active. And then during that round's combat phase, you get enough quest progress to end up clearing it out again. So this is a cool card. It's definitely something that I respect a lot more than I used to, and because I view pretty much every scenario as a puzzle to solve, this is another very compelling answer afforded to the players.
And that brings us to our final card of this adventure pack, the neutral attachment, Song of Kings. It costs 1, and it is aptly a song. It has to attach to a hero, and simply, the attached hero gains the leadership resource icon. So, one of the biggest issues in the early life of the game was running multi-sphere decks and being able to afford the cards. And so one ways they addressed this issue was with songs. It's versatile. They saw a lot of use in the early life of the game. I, for the most part, don't see anyone running all of these sort of sphere-giving songs that will get one for each sphere in this cycle at this point in the game's life. But early on, it was very important, very critical to running a multi-sphere deck.
Yeah, so the bummer about these cards is this does start off the series of different songs, one for each sphere, but we only see one for each adventure pack. So in the very early days, I didn't necessarily find myself crying out for additional leadership resource icon matches. Theodred was generally enough to get me the leadership resources that I need. What is cool about this is it allows players to potentially include a leadership cards in their deck without running a leadership hero. So if you're running a mono lore deck, it's possible that you might use Rivendell Minstrel, you play that, you search through your deck, you find Song of Kings, you play that, and now the sneak attack or Steward of Gondor you are holding in your hand, you've got the resource match required to play those powerful cards. It's going to be important as we see more and more cards and encounter decks that granting a resource icon like this doesn't count as a printed resource icon on the attached hero, but it helps you to just make sure that you can play your cards. It just all comes down to asking yourself, is it worth including in your deck, or is it too much hassle? Are the leadership cards that you include in your deck or might want to include in your deck worth it? Are there easier ways to get a leadership resource icon? Because just like we saw in the core set, there do eventually arise other cards like Calabrian Stone, where it's a very conditional attached hero gains a different resource icon. So Song of Kings is okay. For the first song that we see, it's fine. I'm not exactly wowed by it, but it's a nice little utility card, and I suppose if nothing else, I'm just happy to say that it exists. But at first blush, I think I have to acknowledge that Song of Kings is initially a little underwhelming, and I think that the Hunt for Gollum as a whole doesn't necessarily blow me away, but it certainly plants a lot of seeds of these cards that will eventually kind of blossom and grow into something much more useful than they are at first. But, Matthew, now that we've covered our first new hero, each of our new player cards, including our one neutral card, what are your thoughts on the Hunt for Gollum as our first expansion, our first adventure pack?
So, we had to wait 3 months for this expansion. You mentioned in a previous video that this adventure pack got, I think, delayed by customs twice on its way over from the printer, and a few other things, and man, kind of a dud, you know? And so throughout our entire video, I kept saying to myself, gosh, there's like one magical mystery left to me in this game as far as the design of it. We know that deluxe expansions and the adventure packs are designed at the same time. So the player cards of a deluxe, or in this case, the core set, and the corresponding cycle, again, designed at the same time. So what this expansion really makes me want to think about or want to know more about is how do the designers decide which cards go in which adventure pack? Because knowing the whole cycle as a whole, for the most part, I wouldn't have put any of these cards in the first pack. You sort of alluded to this when you were talking about the Go Fetch or the Tutor cards. Why do we get them in the first AP when there's nothing to go fetch? And certainly you want to have a little bit of interesting effects in each one. You don't want the last pack of a cycle to be nothing but tutor cards or like kind of boring effects. But with this said, it doesn't really make a big splash. The hero is mediocre. For them, the leadership cards are good. But for the most part, it's just it's really a tease of what's to come and didn't shake up deck building after we waited 3 long months to get that adventure pack. So when thinking about the cycle as a whole, I don't think that this is a bad adventure pack, or these are bad cards. But in and of itself, adding them to your core set decks, it really just doesn't add anything new or all that helpful.
Yeah, those tutoring or searching effects, those were not cards that I included for a very, very long time. I did eventually kind of warm up to the Eagles are coming as we get more and more Eagles, but Mustering the Rohirrim was a card that, as someone who played the game for probably its first 2 years or so, I never really played that card. Rohan takes ages before we finally start to get a large number of pretty damn decent allies that might merit your reconsidering including Mustering the Rohirrim in your deck, but that doesn't happen for a very long time. Some of these cards I would include in decks past and I suppose present as well, just because of their stats. Like the Rivendell Minstrel, I'm not sold on Song of Kings at the moment, but I can't exactly turn my nose up at a 3-cost 2 willpower ally at this point. As much as I wish I could pay 2 resources for a 2 willpower ally, that's just frankly not an option, and I'm not using Faramir for questing, even though he's got 2 willpower, and I'm not including Brock Ironfist in my deck. Strider's Path for me came out a little bit too late for me to really play it very often, just because having months and months to play through the core set scenarios, I was essentially done with a lot of nasty travel effects. Our next video is going to be Matthew and I actually taking on the Hunt for Gollum scenario, and pretty much every location in there is, while it's active, it has a nasty effect, or while it's sitting in the staging area, it has a nasty effect. So Strider's Path is fine, but back then it wasn't great. I'm just excited to, when I finally get the opportunity to tackle some nightmare difficulty scenarios and some really difficult scenarios, I'm excited to see the day when Strider's Path is just a remarkably powerful card. So it was kind of initially underwhelming as our very first adventure pack experience, especially after such an artificial, unfortunate delay, but it really sets up a lot of the different patterns or trends that we will see throughout Shadows of Mirkwood. So some Rohan, some Eagles, the signals, the songs, all sorts of good stuff like that. But I suppose I can't really think of too much else to add about the Hunt for Gollum. Be sure to let Matthew and I know in the comments section what your opinion was of these cards back in the day, and whether or not they hold up or are useful at all given our modern card pool. Winged Guardian starts being great, just like Matthew mentioned before, once we see defense strength based questing, and it was good then. So maybe there are some diamonds in the rough here, but I think overall this adventure pack was and is pretty rough. But do you agree? Do you disagree with Matthew and I? Be sure to let us know in the comments. Matthew, thank you for joining me for another episode. And if our listeners want to hear more of you, where can they go to do that?
I would love it if the Progression Series viewers checked out the Gray Company podcast and joined me and my co-hosts for an in-depth look at the Lord of the Rings LCG, where we focus on strategy, deck building, and the metagame. You can find us on Facebook, the interwebs, and on iTunes.
Yeah, so definitely check them out, but thank you for joining us for another episode. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm the Hive Tyrant on Facebook and on Twitter. If you feel any inclination whatsoever to make a small monthly contribution to the ongoing Progression series, I'm on Patreon as well. But thank you once again for joining us, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for much more Lord of the Rings the card game content to come, and take care.